The sun had not yet troubled the highest peaks of the Wasatch Range, but a pale, bruised light was already seeping into the valley. It was the spring of 1885, a season that in this part of Utah Territory was less a gentle awakening and more a reluctant truce between snow and stone. Thatcher Kane felt the cold through the soles of his worn leather boots as he stood on the porch of his ranch house. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth, pine, and the breathing of 100 head of cattle somewhere in the gloom. He held a thick ceramic mug of coffee in both hands, letting the steam warm his face. It was a ritual, the only one he had left that felt entirely his own, a small pocket of warmth against the vast, silent cold of his life. The house behind him was quiet. It had been quiet for 3 years, a deep, settled quiet that had seeped into the very timbers of the walls. He had built this house with his own hands. For Margaret, now, it was just a place to sleep and eat, a shelter from the storms that blew down from the mountains without warning. His day was laid out before him as straight and predictable as a fence line. Check the herd for any signs of sickness or wolves. Mend the section of barbed wire near the creek that the winter melt had loosened. Chop wood until his shoulders ached with a good, clean burn. The work was the point. The work was the prayer and the punishment, and the only thing that stood between him and the crushing weight of memory. He took a long swallow of the hot, black coffee. It was bitter, but it was alive, and that was enough. He saw it then, a flicker of movement on the long, winding dirt track that led up from the direction of Millwater, the small, dusty town a hard half-day ride away. It was too early for a visitor, and he did not get many visitors. He narrowed his eyes, his body tensing with the ingrained caution of a man who lived alone in a wild place. It was not a rider. It was a figure on foot, stumbling, weaving with an exhaustion so profound he could see it from a quarter-mile away. Thatcher set his mug down on the porch rail, his hand automatically going to rest on the worn butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. He did not draw it, but the feel of the cool, heavy steel was a comfort. The figure grew clearer as it drew nearer, resolving itself into the shape of a woman. She was wearing a dark, heavy traveling dress, the hem caked with mud, the fabric torn in several places. A bonnet had fallen to hang down her back by its ribbons, and her hair, a plain brown, was coming undone in wisps that the morning breeze caught and played with. He remained motionless on the porch as she staggered the last 100 yards, her breath coming in ragged, visible puffs in the cold air. She did not seem to be a threat, but trouble came in many forms. Sometimes it came with a gun, and sometimes it came looking for a handout, and Thatcher had little patience for either. She finally reached the bottom step of his porch and stopped, swaying slightly. She had to grip the railing to keep from falling. Her face was pale and smudged with dirt, her eyes a startling shade of blue, wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. She looked to be in her middle 20s, maybe older. It was hard to tell. The trail had a way of adding years to a person. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were her labored breathing and the low sigh of the wind through the tall pines that guarded the ranch. Then she held out a piece of paper, her hand trembling. It was a letter, folded and refolded so many times the creases were worn thin. "Mr. Thatcher Kane?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp, barely more than a whisper. He gave a short, curt nod, his eyes fixed on her. Then, on the letter, "I am—" She seemed to sag with relief, a wave of it so strong it almost took her to her knees. "Thank the Lord. I was not sure I would make it." She pushed the letter toward him again. "I am Eloise Mercer. This is for you." Thatcher did not move to take it. He had never heard her name before in his life. His gaze was hard, questioning. "I am not expecting a letter, or a visitor." Her face fell, the brief flicker of hope in her eyes dimming. "Please," she whispered. "Just read it." With a sigh that was pure irritation, he stepped forward and took the paper from her fingers. He unfolded it. The stationery was of poor quality, thin and already yellowing, but he recognized the faint watermark in the corner. It was the same paper Jake Monroe sold at his general store in Millwater. He began to read. The words were written in an elegant, looping script, a hand that was clearly trying to appear educated. It spoke of loneliness, of the need for a companion to share the burdens and blessings of a life in the West. It spoke of a fine ranch, of a good, steady man in want of a wife. It promised a home, security, a life of dignity. And at the bottom, in the same flowing hand, was a signature. Thatcher Kane. He read it once, then he read it again, a cold, hard knot of anger tightening in his gut. He looked from the letter to the exhausted woman standing before him. Her expectant, hopeful gaze was almost more than he could bear. "This is not my hand," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I did not write this letter." The color drained completely from Eloise Mercer's face. She stared at him, her blue eyes searching his, looking for any sign that he was mistaken, that this was some cruel joke. She saw none. His expression was as hard and unyielding as the granite mountains behind him. What she breathed, the word was a puff of disbelief. "But it has your name. It says you were seeking a wife." "I am not," he said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. The very idea was an insult, a betrayal of the memory that lived in the silent rooms of his house. "Someone has played you for a fool, Miss Mercer. And they have used my name to do it." She shook her head slowly, a dazed, lost motion. "No, that cannot be. I have come so far." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, he saw the sheen of tears in her eyes, tears of pure, soul-deep weariness. "I have traveled 2,000 miles. The number hung in the air between them, a testament to a hope so strong it had carried her across a continent. Only to die here, on his porch, in the cold Utah dawn. Thatcher felt a flicker of something, a grudging pity perhaps, but it was quickly smothered by his own sense of violation. Someone had used his name, had offered up his life and his home to a stranger without his knowledge or consent. He folded the letter and held it out to her. "I am sorry for your trouble, but it is not my trouble. My advice to you is to go back to Millwater and ask the sheriff for help." She did not take the letter. She just stared at him, her body trembling now, not just from the cold, but from the shock. "Go back. I have nowhere to go back to. I spent every last cent I had on the train ticket, on the stagecoach. This was everything." Thoroughly angry now. At her, at the situation, at the anonymous writer of the letter, Thatcher's patience snapped. "That is not my concern. I run a cattle ranch. Miss Mercer, not a charity for lost women." The words were cruel, and he knew it the moment they left his mouth. He saw her flinch as if he had struck her. Her chin came up, a spark of pride, of defiance, lighting her tired eyes. She drew herself up, a small, straight figure against the immense backdrop of the valley. "I am not asking for charity, Mr. Kane. I am asking for what I was promised. And I am telling you," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "that I promised you nothing." They stood there, locked in a stalemate, the forged letter, a worthless treaty between them. And then, as if on cue, the sky began to change. The pale light of morning was being swallowed by a mass of bruised, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. The wind picked up, a low moan that grew into a sharp, biting howl. It carried the scent of rain, a cold, metallic smell. A fat, icy drop hit Thatcher's cheek. Another hit the wooden porch rail with a dark splash. Within moments, a steady, driving rain was falling, slanting almost sideways in the wind. It was not a gentle spring shower. It was a deluge, the kind that could turn a dry creek bed into a raging torrent in under an hour. The dirt track she had just walked up was already turning into a slick, impassable river of mud. Eloise Mercer shivered, wrapping her thin arms around herself. The rain was soaking her already worn dress. plastering it to her frame. She looked small and fragile and utterly defeated. Thatcher cursed under his breath. He looked out at the storm, at the sheets of water obscuring the mountains, at the muddy road that was now a barrier. There would be no going to Millwater today, or tomorrow by the looks of it. The creek would be too high to cross safely. He was trapped, and so was she. He looked back at the woman. Her pride was gone, washed away by the cold rain. All that was left was a quiet, desperate misery. He thought of turning his back, of going inside and shutting the door, of leaving her to the mercy of the elements. It was what the harsh logic of this land dictated. You take care of your own, you do not invite trouble in. But then he thought of Margaret, of her quiet kindness, of what she would have said. He thought of the wolves he sometimes heard howling from the ridge at night, their calls echoing in the vast, empty darkness. He could not leave her out here. Whatever else he was not a man who would leave a dog to die in a storm, let alone a woman. With a heavy, resentful sigh, he finally moved. He picked up his forgotten coffee mug and pushed the door to his house open. "Get inside," he said, his voice rough, devoid of any warmth. "You can stay until the road clears. Then you are on your own." Eloise Mercer looked at him, then at the dark, open doorway. It was not the welcome she had dreamed of for 2,000 miles, but it was shelter. It was a reprieve, with a silent, grateful nod. She slowly, painfully, climbed the steps and walked past him into the quiet, lonely house. Thatcher stood on the porch for a moment longer, watching the rain lash the valley, feeling the cold seep deeper into his bones. The trouble had come right to his door, and he had just let it in. The inside of the house was clean, orderly, and profoundly empty. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, but the hearth was swept clean, the andirons bare. The furniture was solid and well made. A long wooden table with 4 chairs, a sturdy armchair, and a bookshelf holding a few worn volumes. There were no pictures on the walls, no braided rugs on the floor, none of the small, soft touches that turn a structure into a home. It was a place built for a life that was no longer lived there. Thatcher gestured curtly to a narrow door beside the main hearth. "There is a room in there. It is small, but it is dry. There is a cot." He did not offer her a change of clothes because he had none to give. Margaret's things had been packed away in a trunk in the loft years ago, and he would not disturb them. "I will see to the stock." Without another word, he turned, grabbed a heavy oilskin slicker from a peg by the door, and went back out into the raging storm, shutting the door firmly behind him. Eloise was left standing in the middle of the quiet room, dripping a puddle onto the clean plank floor. The chill had settled deep into her bones, a cold that was more than just the rain. It was the cold of utter failure. She had wagered everything on a single, fragile hope, and it had shattered. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean against the wall, the exhaustion of physical weight pressing her down. But to collapse was to surrender, and she had not come 2,000 miles to surrender. Taking a slow, deep breath, she straightened up. She went into the small room he had indicated. It was just as he said, small, dry, with a narrow cot, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single small window that looked out onto the churning, rain-swept yard. It was more than she had any right to expect. After washing the travel grime from her face and hands, she felt a sliver of her strength return. She could not just sit and wait. She was a guest here, an unwanted one, under a roof that was not hers by right but by the thinnest thread of a man's grudging decency. She had to be useful. She ventured back into the main room and from there into the kitchen. Like the rest of the house, it was scrubbed clean but had an air of disuse. A sack of flour sat in the corner, a canister of sugar, a bin of potatoes. It was a kitchen waiting for a cook. On a shelf, she found a crock of sourdough starter, still alive, if sluggish, An idea took hold. It was a small thing, but it was something she knew how to do. She could make bread. Working with quiet efficiency, she stoked the embers in the wood stove, added fresh kindling until a steady warmth began to push back against the room's chill. She measured flour, water, and salt, her hands moving with the familiar, comforting rhythm of the task. As she kneaded the dough, she felt the tight knot of despair in her chest begin to loosen. Just a fraction. This was real, the feel of the dough, the warmth of the stove, the steady drumming of the rain on the roof, while the dough rose in a greased bowl near the stove. She set about tidying the already tidy space, wiping down counters that did not need wiping, arranging tins, sweeping a floor that was already clean. She was putting a piece of herself into the room, reclaiming a small piece of her own dignity through the simple act of work. When Thatcher came back in hours later, soaked through and weary, he stopped dead in the doorway. The air was different. It was warm, for one thing, and it smelled of yeast and baking bread, a scent so deeply tied to Margaret, to a life he had buried, that it hit him like a physical blow. He saw Eloise by the stove, her face flushed from the heat, her hands dusted with flour. She had taken down a slab of bacon hanging from the rafters and was slicing it into a cast-iron skillet. For a long moment, he said nothing, his face an unreadable mask. He was an intruder in his own kitchen. Eloise looked up, startled by his silence. "I hope you do not mind. Mr. Kane, I found the starter and I thought a hot meal might be welcome." He grunted, shrugging out of his wet slicker and hanging it on the peg. He did not say that he minded, but he did not say that he was grateful either. He simply took a seat at the long table, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, and waited. The silence between them was thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the sizzle of the bacon and the howl of the wind. She served him a plate of fried bacon and thick slices of the fresh, warm bread, its crust crackly and its inside soft as a cloud. He ate without comment, but he ate every last crumb. When he was finished, he pushed his plate back and finally looked at her. "The creek is rising fast," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We will be stuck here for 2 days, maybe 3. Eloise simply nodded, her hands clasped in her lap. Thatcher's eyes fell upon the letter, which she had carefully dried and left sitting on the mantelpiece. He stared at it for a long time before he spoke again. "Let me see that again." She retrieved it and handed it to him. He motioned for her to sit opposite him at the table. He lit the oil lamp in the center, and its golden glow pushed back the encroaching twilight, casting their faces in flickering light and shadow. The house felt smaller, more intimate in the lamplight. He spread the letter out flat, smoothing the creases with his calloused thumb. This time, he was not looking at the words, but at the way they were formed. The flamboyant, looping and K in the signature, the slightly ostentatious curl of the and It was a script that wanted to be admired. "This watermark," he said more to himself than to her. "It is from Jake Monroe's general store. He is the only one in Millwater who orders his paper from St. Louis." He looked up at her, his gray eyes intent. "Did you have any other correspondence before you came out here?" She shook her head. "No, just that one. It was in response to an advertisement I placed in a Boston newspaper." His gaze returned to the handwriting. He had seen it before, but where he thought of the receipts he signed at the store, the ledgers Jake kept behind the counter. Jake Monroe, his friend since they were boys, the man who had been his best man when he married Margaret. Jake's handwriting was just like this. Proud, a little too neat for a man who ran a store. It was Jake's hand. The realization settled in his gut like a cold stone. "Jake," he breathed, the name a whisper of disbelief and dawning fury. "That son of a—" He cut the word off, slamming his palm down on the table, making the lamp jump and the flame flicker wildly. Eloise flinched, her eyes wide with alarm. "What is it? Do you know who wrote it?" "I think so," he said, his voice tight with a rage that was far more potent than his earlier irritation. This was not the work of a stranger. This was a betrayal. It seems my best friend has a talent for fiction. He stood up and began to pace the length of the room, his long strides eating up the space. To use my name, to bring you all this way, what in God's name was he thinking? Seeing the storm in his eyes, Eloise felt a new kind of fear. She had been the catalyst for this, the unwitting bomb tossed into this man's life, set to destroy a lifelong friendship. She had to make him understand. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice quiet but firm, forcing him to stop pacing and look at her. "Please, you need to know why I answered the letter, why I had to leave." He stopped, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression hard. "Go on." She took a breath, choosing her words with care. "For the past 2 years, I have been employed at a boarding house in Boston. It was run by a man named Silas Garrett." She paused, the memory making her hands tremble. Mr. Garrett. He was not a kind employer. He believes that the women who work for him owe him more than just their labor. He makes their lives difficult if they do not comply with his wishes. He takes liberties. She did not need to be more specific. The look in her eyes conveyed the quiet dread, the constant, low-level threat she had lived under. He held our wages, found reasons to make us indebted to him. It was a trap. One girl tried to leave, and he had the constables bring her back, claiming she had stolen from him. We were his property in his eyes. I saw that letter, that advertisement, as a lifeline, a chance for a decent life, a chance to be safe. It was the only way I could think to escape him. Thatcher listened, his anger slowly being tempered by the bleak reality of her story. He had known men like Garrett, men who used their power and position to prey on those with neither. His rage at Jake was still there, a hot coal in his chest. But now it was joined by a cold disgust for this Silas Garrett. "So you ran," he said. It was not a question. "I left in the middle of the night with what little I could carry," she confirmed. "I am sure Mr. Garrett considers me a thief. He will not take kindly to being defied." The confession hung in the air between them. Thatcher looked at this woman, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not just a dupe or an inconvenience, but a person of courage, someone who had risked everything for the simple hope of a life free from fear. The rising loaf of bread on the stove seemed to fill the room with its warm, life-affirming scent, a stark contrast to the cold, shrinking feeling in his heart. The home Margaret had made was warm. His own lonely existence was cold. He finally walked back to the table and sat down, running a hand through his dark, grizzled hair. "When this storm breaks, I am riding to Millwater," he said, his voice heavy with resolve. "I am going to have a talk with Jake Monroe." He did not say what he would do about her. He did not offer any promises, but something had shifted between them. They were no longer just a man and an unwanted guest. They were two strangers, bound together by a lie, facing a future that was as uncertain and turbulent as the storm that continued to rage outside. Later that night, as the rain finally began to slacken to a steady drizzle, Thatcher stood by the main window, looking out into the darkness. The clouds parted for a moment, and a sliver of moon cast a pale, ghostly light over the wet landscape. And in that brief moment of clarity, he saw it, far out, on the low ridge that marked the southern edge of his property, was the silhouette of a man on horseback. He was sitting perfectly still, watching the house, just watching. Then, as if sensing he had been seen, the rider turned his horse and melted back into the shadows. Thatcher's hand fell to the pistol at his hip. The trouble he had let in was one thing. He was beginning to suspect there was more trouble on its way. The days that followed were governed by the rhythm of the water. The rain softened to a persistent drizzle, then stopped. But the creek, fed by 1,000 melting rivulets from the high country, remained a churning, brown beast. The world was mud and mist. The road to Millwater did not exist. Within the confines of the ranch house, an unspoken truce settled between Thatcher and Eloise. The subject of the letter, of Jake Monroe, of her eventual departure, was a locked room they both tacitly agreed not to enter. A new routine, fragile and strange, began to weave itself into the fabric of their days. Eloise rose before him, her movements quiet so as not to wake him from his cot in the main room, where he now slept. She would have the fire going and coffee brewing by the time he came in from his first check of the herd. She discovered a small, neglected chicken coop behind the house with a handful of scruffy hens. Soon, there were fresh eggs for breakfast. She found the remains of a vegetable garden, choked with weeds but holding the stubborn promise of last year's herbs. She pulled the weeds, her hands in the dirt, feeling a connection to the woman who had planted the sage and thyme, a ghost whose presence was everywhere in this silent house. She served in his kitchen by day. She baked bread. She put a great pot of beans on the back of the stove to simmer, filling the house with a savory warmth that felt both welcoming and alien. She mended the tear in her dress with a needle and thread she found in a sewing box, her stitches small and neat. These small acts of domesticity were her anchor. She was earning her keep, paying her way with work. Not charity, but a quiet fear gnawed at her. This peace she felt, this strange sense of safety within these four walls, was temporary. It was a borrowed life, and soon the debt would come due. She was a guest, a piece of driftwood washed up by a storm, and when the waters receded, she would be left on the shore again. Thatcher watched her from a distance. He would come in for his midday meal to find the table set, the food hot. He would eat, his silence a wall between them, and then retreat back to the unending work of the ranch. He repaired the fence lines the storm had damaged, his movements economical and strong. He spent hours in the saddle, riding the perimeter of his land, his eyes scanning for the gray shapes of wolves drawn in by the scent of the herd. The sight of the lone horseman had not been repeated, but the feeling of being watched lingered at the edge of his senses. Her presence in his house was a constant, low-grade ache. The smell of baking bread was Margaret's smell. The sight of a woman's form moving through his kitchen was a scene from a life he had lost. It felt like a betrayal. One evening, after a particularly silent supper, he found himself drawn to the bookshelf. He pulled out Margaret's Bible. It was bound in worn black leather. Her name, Margaret Kane, embossed in faded gold leaf on the cover. He opened it to a page marked with a thin silk ribbon. Tucked inside was a single pressed wildflower, a blue columbine, its color still vibrant, its form perfectly preserved. It was from their first spring in this valley. He remembered the day she had picked it, her laughter echoing against the mountains. He closed the book with a snap, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Eloise looked up from her mending, her blue eyes questioning. He felt a surge of irrational anger, a need to protect this memory from the living, breathing woman sitting across from him. "The water will be down by morning," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "The road should be clear enough for you to get back to town." Eloise's hands stilled in her lap. The needle stopped its steady work. So the truce was over. "I see," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I will give you enough money for the stagecoach east," he continued, not looking at her, staring instead at the Bible in his hands. "It is the least I can do. Considering the kindness of your friend," she asked, a slight edge to her tone. She could not help it. His charity felt like a dismissal, another form of being unwanted. "Is this just a debt you feel you must pay?" "Mr. Kane, a way to clear your conscience before you send me away." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes stormy. "This has nothing to do with my conscience. It has to do with what is right. You do not belong here." "And where is it that I do belong?" she shot back, her voice rising with a passion that surprised them both. "Back in Mr. Garrett's boarding house. You know why I cannot go back there. This kindness of yours, this shelter, what is it if not a lie? You let me stay. You let me work. You let me start to feel safe. And all the while you are just counting the moments until you can be rid of me." "It is not a lie," he ground out, stung by the accusation. "It is practical. You were caught in a storm. Now the storm is over." "Is it?" she whispered, her fight suddenly draining away, leaving her looking tired and vulnerable again. "It does not feel over to me." Before he could answer, a new sound intruded, a low, desperate bawling from the direction of the creek. It was the sound of cattle in distress. Thatcher was on his feet in an instant, the argument forgotten, his rancher's instincts taking over. He grabbed his slicker. "Stay here," he commanded, and was out the door. But Eloise followed him onto the porch. The sky was clear, but the creek was a monster. It had breached its banks and was now a wide, muddy lake, creeping steadily up the lower pasture where a portion of the herd was grazing. The cattle were panicked, trapped between the rising water and a steep, rocky embankment. "I can help," she said, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. He gave her a sharp, disbelieving look, but there was no time to argue. "All right, keep to the high ground. If you see any trying to break away, yell, just yell." What followed was a chaotic, desperate struggle against the rising flood. Thatcher waded into the churning, thigh-deep water, his horse slipping and scrambling in the mud, as he worked to push the terrified animals toward a narrow game trail that led to the higher ground of the main pasture. Eloise, her skirts hitched up, scrambled along the ridge, her voice joining his, calling to the cattle, turning back the stragglers, her presence a second point of pressure that helped guide the panicked herd. The water was shockingly cold, a frigid, greedy thing that sucked the warmth from their bodies. It took hours. By the time the last cow was safely on the high meadow, the sun was setting, painting the waterlogged valley in shades of orange and purple. They were both soaked to the bone, shivering, and caked in mud. As they made one last check, Eloise spotted it a tiny, newborn calf, lying half-submerged in a thicket of willows, too weak to follow its mother. It was trembling violently, its breath coming in shallow pants. Thatcher rode over and looked down at the creature with a grim, pragmatic eye. "It is no good. We leave it. The mother will have already forgotten it." "No," Eloise said, her voice fierce. She slid down the muddy bank and waded into the water toward the calf. "We cannot just leave it to die." "It is the way of things," he said, his voice weary. "We cannot save them all." "We can save this one," she insisted. She reached the calf and gathered the small, shivering body into her arms. It was a dead weight, barely alive, with a strength born of pure defiance. She carried it back up the bank. Back at the house, Thatcher built up the fire until it was roaring. He brought in blankets while Eloise gently dried the calf with old sacks. It was still shivering, its life flickering like a weak candle flame. Thatcher had already written it off, but Eloise refused to give up. She went to the small, overgrown herb garden she had been tending. In the fading light, her fingers searched for and found what she was looking for, a clump of yarrow and the tough, resilient leaves of a plantain weed. Inside, she crushed the herbs and steeped them in hot water, creating a fragrant, steaming poultice. She wrapped it in a strip of clean cloth and laid it on the calf's chest, then trickled a few drops of a warm willow bark tea between its lips. Thatcher watched her, a silent, skeptical observer. It was foolishness, he thought. Old wives' remedies against the cold, hard facts of nature. He himself was shivering now, a deep, bone-rattling chill that had nothing to do with the drying of his clothes. The hours in the icy water had taken their toll. He felt a weariness that went beyond muscle and bone, settling deep inside him. He sat heavily in the armchair by the fire, pulling a blanket around his shoulders. But he could not get warm. Eloise worked on the calf for over an hour, her focus absolute. And then, a small miracle occurred. The calf's shivering began to subside. It lifted its head weakly and gave a small, bleating cry. A little later, it struggled to its feet on wobbly legs and nudged her hand. looking for milk. It was going to live. Eloise looked up at Thatcher, a triumphant, weary smile on her face. But the smile faded when she saw him. He was slumped in the chair, his face pale, his eyes glassy. He was shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering despite the roaring fire and the thick wool blanket. The chill he had contracted in the floodwaters had taken root, and a dangerous fever was setting in. The song of a meadowlark, clear and bright after the storm, trilled from a fence post outside. A new season had arrived, but inside the small ranch house, the immediate crisis of the flood had passed only to be replaced by another, quieter and far more intimate. The rancher, the strong, self-sufficient man who had offered her temporary shelter, was now the one in need of care. The meadowlark's song was drowned out by the chattering of Thatcher's teeth. Eloise went to him, her brief moment of triumph over the calf's survival evaporating into a new, more urgent fear. She placed a hand on his forehead. It was burning hot, yet his skin was clammy and pale. His eyes, when they focused on her, were clouded with the dull sheen of a high fever. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "Thatcher, you need to get into bed. You are ill." He tried to push himself up from the chair, to protest, to reassert the rigid control he held over himself and his world. But a violent wave of shivering racked his body, forcing him back down. He was weaker than he knew. "It is nothing," he mumbled, the words slurring slightly. "Just a chill." But it was more than a chill. It was a fever born of ice-cold water and bone-deep exhaustion, and it was taking hold with a frightening speed. The armchair here in the main room was drafty. The cot he had been using was too close to the floor, where the cold air settled. There was only one other bed in the house, in the room he had not entered in 3 years, the master bedroom, his and Margaret's. There was no choice. The practical reality of the situation overrode every unspoken taboo, every ghost that lingered in the corners of the house, with an effort that seemed to drain the last of her own strength. Eloise helped him to his feet. He leaned heavily on her, a surprising, solid weight. His breath was hot against her cheek, and she could feel the tremors that shook his powerful frame. She guided him through the doorway into the other room. It was colder in here, the air still and thick with the scent of lavender and cedar from a chest at the foot of the bed. The bed itself was a large, imposing piece of furniture, carved from dark wood, the headboard reaching nearly to the ceiling. It was neatly made, covered with a heavy patchwork quilt, a monument in a shrine. She helped him sit on the edge of the mattress, then pulled off his wet, muddy boots. He was barely coherent now, mumbling about the cattle, the flood, a fence line that needed mending. His defenses were gone, stripped away by the fever, leaving him vulnerable, his mind adrift. Eloise left him for a moment and returned with a basin of cool water and a clean cloth. She found a nightshirt in a dresser drawer, the cotton soft from many washings, and helped him out of his damp clothes and into it. He complied without protest, his movements clumsy, his body pliant in her hands. She pulled back the quilt and guided him under the covers. He sank into the feather mattress with a low groan, his eyes closing almost immediately. The night deepened. Outside, the wind rose again, not with the fury of the storm, but with a low, mournful sigh that rattled the window panes. A slow, cold rain began to fall, a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof shingles. It was a sound that seemed to measure the long, slow passing of the hours. Eloise sat in a straight-backed chair she had pulled up beside the bed, watching him. The oil lamp on the bedside table cast a small circle of warm, wavering light, leaving the rest of the room in deep shadow, in the grip of the fever. Thatcher's face had lost its hard, guarded expression. He looked younger, the lines of worry and grief smoothed away, leaving only a stark, defenseless humanity. He tossed and turned, caught in a restless, fevered sleep. muttering names she did not recognize. Once, he called out Margaret's name, a single, sharp cry of loss that was so raw, so full of pain. It made Eloise's own heart ache in sympathy. She bathed his forehead and his wrists with the cool, damp cloth. She sat and listened to his labored breathing, to the rain on the roof, to the creaks and groans of the house. This was a different kind of service than the one she had performed in his kitchen. This was a vigil. She was the sole guardian of his flickering life. This man who was a stranger to her. This man who held her own precarious future in his hands. Sometime after midnight, a new sound began. A steady drip, drip, drip. She looked up and saw a dark stain spreading on the ceiling above the main room, directly over the cot where he had been sleeping. The storm had found a weakness in the roof. A small pool of water was already forming on the floor. The main room was growing colder, damper. It was no place for a sick man. She looked at the large bed, at the empty space beside Thatcher's restless form. The room, with the heat from the lamp and their combined body warmth, was the warmest, driest place in the house. The thought of lying down beside him was scandalous, a violation of every rule of propriety. If anyone from the town were to find them like this, their reputations, both his and hers, would be utterly destroyed. It would confirm every ugly suspicion the gossips might harbor about a lone woman living in a widower's home. But the alternative was to sit, shivering, in a cold, straight-backed chair all night while the man she was trying to save lay burning with fever. The choice was between a hypothetical social ruin and a present, practical duty. She rose and walked to the window, looking out at the black, rain-swept darkness. This whole journey, this whole impossible situation, had been dictated by forces beyond her control. She had been sent here by a well-meaning lie, trapped here by a flood, and now was bound to this man's side by a sickness. A strange, quiet thought formed in her mind, a line of narration for her own improbable story. She served in his kitchen by day. She whispered to the reflection of her own pale, tired face in the glass, but unexpectedly ended up in the rancher's bed by fate. The words, spoken aloud in the quiet room, seemed to settle something within her. It was not a surrender, but an acceptance. She was doing what she had to do. With a sense of calm resolve, she walked back to the bed. She did not remove her dress, but simply took off her shoes and slipped under the covers on the far side of the mattress, lying on top of the quilt. The warmth from his body reached across the space between them, a dry, intense heat. She lay stiffly at first, every muscle tense, acutely aware of his presence, of the intimacy of the shared space. He moaned in his sleep and rolled toward her, his arm flinging out, his hand brushing against hers. His skin was fiery. Instinctively, she closed her fingers around his. His hand was large, rough, the hand of a man who worked the land, but in its fevered state, it felt strangely fragile. He seemed to quiet at her touch, his restless thrashing subsiding into a deeper, less troubled sleep. And so she lay there, holding his hand, a silent guardian in the dark. The act was chaste, a simple human connection, a sharing of warmth against the cold, a promise of presence against the lonely dark. She was not taking a liberty. She was offering comfort. She was not a temptress in a rancher's bed. She was a nurse, a caretaker, claiming the right to be gentle in a world that had shown her little gentleness. The rain continued its soft, steady drumming on the roof, a sound like destiny's patient, persistent knock. The oil lamp flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. In the heart of the vast, wild Utah night, in a room full of ghosts and memories, two strangers lay in a single bed, separated by a world of experience, yet bound together by a fever, a storm, and the simple, profound act of one human being caring for another. His breathing began to deepen, to even out, the ragged edge of the fever softening into something less dangerous. Life was reasserting itself, quietly, stubbornly. in the shared warmth of the bed. The vigil would continue until dawn. A long, slow prayer whispered in the language of shared breath and the steady beat of two hearts in the quiet dark. The fever broke just before dawn. Thatcher woke to the cool, clear light of a world washed clean. The rain had stopped, and the air coming through the open window was crisp and clean. He was weak, his body feeling hollowed out and distant, but his mind was clear for the first time in what felt like days. He was in his own bed, and he was not alone. Eloise was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, her face pale with exhaustion. A basin of water sat on the bedside table, a damp cloth folded neatly beside it. He saw the dark, damp patch on the ceiling in the other room, the small puddle on the floor. He understood. In a silent, intuitive flash, everything that had happened. She had cared for him. She had stayed with him through the night, through the worst of the fever. A complicated emotion, one he could not name, stirred in his chest. It was gratitude, but it was tangled with a profound sense of unease. He had been vulnerable, and she had seen it. 2 days later, the sun had worked its magic on the muddy road. It was passable. The air of quiet domesticity that had settled over the ranch was gone, replaced by a tense, unspoken purpose. Thatcher hitched a team of horses to the buckboard wagon. He was still weak, but a grim resolve had settled over him, hardening his face back into its familiar, stoic mask. "I am going to Millwater," he announced, his voice rough from disuse. He did not ask Eloise to come, but he did not tell her to stay. He simply waited by the wagon, the reins in his hands. Eloise came out of the house wearing her bonnet, her traveling dress cleaned and mended as best she could. She carried a small bundle of her few belongings. Her face was calm, but her eyes were full of a quiet dread. She knew this was the end of her strange interlude at the ranch. She climbed onto the wagon seat beside him without a word. The ride to town was silent. Thatcher kept his eyes on the road. His jaw set. The valley, green and vibrant after the rain, seemed oblivious to the human drama passing through it. When they reached the dusty main street of Millwater, Thatcher pulled the wagon to a halt directly in front of Monroe's general store. The sign above the door, painted in Jake's proud, looping script, creaked in the breeze. "Wait here," Thatcher said to Eloise, his voice low. He swung down from the wagon and strode into the store. Jake Monroe was behind the counter, weighing out a sack of beans for a customer. He was a cheerful, stout man with a booming laugh and a ready smile. He looked up when Thatcher entered, and his smile widened. "Thatcher, good to see you. My friend, I was worried that storm had washed you away." Thatcher walked to the counter and, without a word, slapped the forged letter down on the polished wood. "Did you write this?" "Jake," he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Jake's smile vanished. He looked at the letter, then at Thatcher's cold, hard face, and the color drained from his own. He swallowed hard. "Now, Thatcher, just hold on a minute." "Did you write it?" Thatcher repeated, his voice like the strike of a hammer on an anvil. Jake glanced past Thatcher through the open doorway and saw Eloise sitting on the wagon, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He let out a long, defeated sigh. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I wrote it." The customer, sensing a storm of a different kind brewing, quickly paid for his beans and scurried out of the store. They were alone. Why, Thatcher demanded, "Why would you do such a thing? Use my name, bring a woman 2,000 miles on a fool's errand." "It was not a fool's errand," Jake protested, finding a sliver of his usual bluster. "Look at you, Thatcher. It has been 3 years since Margaret. You are turning to stone out there. You are dying on your feet, and you do not even see it. I thought you needed a push. I read the lady's advertisement, and she sounded decent. I just wanted to help. It was a good intention." "A good intention," Thatcher's voice rose, the quiet fury breaking into a raw, incredulous rage. "You call this a good intention? You lied to me. Jake, you lied to her. You played God with our lives." "I will make it right," Jake said quickly, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "I will explain it to her. I will pay for her ticket back east. I will take full responsibility." Thatcher just shook his head, a deep, bitter disappointment settling over him. "It is not that simple. You cannot just fix this, Jake." As if to prove his point, the door to the store swung open again. 2 men entered. The first was a large man, dressed in a fancy Eastern suit that looked out of place in the dusty store. His face was fleshy and pale, his eyes small and calculating. He had the predatory stillness of a spider. The second man was slighter, with a thin, cruel mouth and a lawyer's satchel clutched in his hand. Eloise, from her seat on the wagon, saw the men enter the store. A gasp escaped her lips. She recognized the first man instantly. It was Silas Garrett. Garrett's eyes swept the store and landed on Thatcher. Then he saw Eloise through the doorway. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice a greasy purr that made the hairs on the back of Thatcher's neck stand up. "There you are, my dear Eloise. I have come a long, long way to find you." Eloise felt a cold wave of terror wash over her. She had run 2,000 miles, but the trap had followed her. Garrett turned his attention to Thatcher. "And you must be the man who has been harboring my runaway employee. My name is Silas Garrett. This is my legal counsel, Mr. Finch. It seems Miss Mercer here has broken her employment contract, a contract which is legally binding in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and, I am assured, here in this fine territory as well." "Mr. Finch stepped forward and opened his satchel, producing a sheaf of papers filled with dense, legalistic script and an official-looking seal. "We are here to claim compensation for Miss Mercer's breach of contract, and for the slanderous lies she has undoubtedly told about Mr. Garrett's fine establishment." Thatcher looked from Garrett's smug face to Eloise's terrified one, and then back to Jake, who looked as if he was about to be sick. The lie, born of a good intention, had grown into a monster. "She has no contract with you," Thatcher said, his voice a low growl. "Oh, but she does," Garrett said smoothly. "Signed and sealed. I am a reasonable man. I am prepared to settle this matter for a modest sum, $500, or, perhaps, a portion of your fine cattle herd would suffice. I have a buyer already lined up, a local man, Mr. Jed Barlow." At the mention of Barlow's name, Jake's head snapped up. Jed Barlow was the leader of a gang of rustlers who had been plaguing the valley for months. He was bad news. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This was not a chance encounter. It was a coordinated attack. Garrett and Barlow were working together, using Eloise as the lever to pry Thatcher's ranch away from him. "I am not giving you a single dollar," Thatcher said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. Just then, the door opened again. Sheriff Ada Long entered the store. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with piercing blue eyes and a badge pinned to her simple, practical dress. She took in the scene with a quick, practiced glance. Thatcher, rigid with anger. Jake, pale and sweating. The 2 strangers from the east, and the frightened woman on the wagon outside. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. Garrett turned on his oily charm. "No problem at all. Sheriff, just a simple business matter. This woman," he said, gesturing toward Eloise, "is an absconding employee. I have the paperwork right here." Sheriff Long walked over and took the papers from Mr. Finch. She scanned them, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, however, were not on the legal jargon. They were on Eloise, who had climbed down from the wagon and was now standing in the doorway, a silent, trembling witness to her own fate. The sheriff's gaze settled on Eloise's wrist, where a thin, pale scar, the shape of a half-moon, was visible just below the cuff of her sleeve. It was an old mark, but one that told a story. The sheriff made a small, almost imperceptible note in the little book she always carried. The scales of justice, represented by the brass balance scale sitting on Jake Monroe's counter, seemed to tilt precariously. On one side was the weight of legal papers, of money, of a powerful man's word. On the other was the unspoken testimony of a woman with no standing, no credibility, and a telltale scar on her wrist. The air in the store was thick with unspoken threats, with lies and half-truths. The sign outside creaked back and forth in the wind, a lonely, rhythmic sound marking the slow, agonizing moments of a confrontation that had just begun. The night was a restless one. An unnatural stillness had fallen over the valley, the kind that often precedes a storm or a violent act. Thatcher did not sleep. He sat on the porch steps, a rifle across his lap. His senses stretched thin. The confrontation in town had left a foul taste in his mouth, a feeling of a net being drawn tight. Garrett's slick threats, the cold ambition in Barlow's eyes. It was a sickness that had followed Eloise from the east and now threatened to poison his land. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. Sometime past midnight, the first sound came. It was not the howl of a wolf or the cry of a night bird. It was a series of sharp, whip-like cracks from the far side of the pasture, followed by a fizzing hiss, firecrackers. Before the last hiss faded, a low rumble began. A vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It grew with terrifying speed into the sound of a living earthquake, the thunder of 1,000 panicked hooves. Stampede, Thatcher breathed, the single word a curse and a call to action. He was already moving, yelling Eloise's name as he ran for the corral. She met him at the door, her face a pale oval in the gloom, her eyes wide with fear but not panic. There was no need for explanation. The sound told the whole story. "Saddle the mare," he yelled as he threw a bridle on his own powerful gelding. "And stay behind me, no matter what." They rode out into the maelstrom. A light, dusty rain had begun to fall, turning the air into a gritty, blinding haze. The herd was a single, monstrous entity, a river of horns and terrified eyes, flowing blindly away from the source of its fear. They were headed straight for the broken, rugged country at the north end of the valley, a maze of gullies and ravines where they would pile up and be crushed, or run themselves off cliffs in the dark. This was Barlow's plan. Not just to scatter the herd, but to destroy it, to leave Thatcher with nothing left to sell but broken carcasses at a beggar's price. They rode like furies, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the rocks. Thatcher rode on the flank, trying to turn the lead steers, to bend the direction of the flow. Eloise, her fear locked down tight, rode behind, her presence helping to keep the rear of the herd from splintering off. They were a tiny, two-person dam against a raging river of flesh. For what felt like an eternity, they made no progress. The herd was a force of nature, deaf and blind with terror. They were nearing the edge of a deep, dry wash, its lip invisible in the drizzling dark. A led steer went over, its panicked bellow cut short. "They are going into the wash," Thatcher yelled over the din. "We have to turn them now." He spurred his horse forward, pushing into the dense mass of cattle, trying to force the leaders to veer west. Eloise moved with him, her mare nimble and sure-footed, but in the chaos, a panicked bull swerved, slamming into her horse's flank. The mare screamed and stumbled, her front legs buckling. Eloise was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the slick, muddy ground, just feet from the crumbling edge of the ravine. Thatcher saw it happen. A cold, absolute terror, sharper than any he had ever known, seized him. He turned his gelding in a move that seemed to defy gravity, spurring the horse through the press of bodies. He reached Eloise as she was trying to scramble to her feet, the ground giving way beneath her. Without slowing, he leaned down from the saddle, his arm shooting out, and clamped his hand around her wrist. He hauled her upward, pulling her from the ground and swinging her up to sit in front of him on the saddle. all in one fluid, desperate motion. She clung to him, her face buried against his chest, her body trembling. He held her tight for a single heartbeat of a second, the solid, living warmth of her a shield against the terror. "I have got you," he said, his voice a rough growl against her hair. And then, through the chaos, a new sound. Shouts, the thunder of more horses. A group of riders appeared out of the gloom, swinging ropes and yelling, their lanterns cutting yellow swaths through the dusty rain. At the lead was Jake Monroe, his face set with a grim determination. He had brought help. He had seen the firecrackers from town and known what they meant. He was making his atonement not with words, but with action. With the extra riders, they finally gained control. They turned the herd, slowly, painfully, away from the ravine, circling them in a wide, milling eddy of confusion until the panic finally subsided into exhaustion. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. The pasture was torn to ribbons, but the herd, bruised and battered, was largely intact. As Thatcher and Eloise rode beside Jake on the slow drive back toward the ranch, no words were exchanged, none were needed. A debt had been paid. By mid-morning, the entire town of Millwater seemed to be gathered in the dusty space in front of the general store. Sheriff Long, wanting to settle the matter before it escalated into gunplay, had declared a public hearing. It was not a formal court of law, but in a place like this, the judgment of the community was often more swift and final. Thatcher and Eloise stood on the store's porch, facing the crowd. Garrett and his lawyer, Mr. Finch, stood opposite them, looking confident. Thatcher saw Garrett slip a folded bill into the hand of the town clerk, who was meant to be keeping the record. A small, slick motion that made his blood boil. Sheriff Long called for order. "Mr. Garrett has made a claim against Miss Mercer. We are here to hear both sides." "Mr. Finch began. His voice droned on about contracts and obligations, painting Eloise as a dishonest, flighty woman. The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A woman traveling alone. Living at a widower's ranch, it was a story that was easy to twist into something ugly. Then it was Eloise's turn. She looked at Thatcher. He met her gaze, his own eyes saying everything he could not. "You can do this." He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. Then he took a small step back, positioning himself at her side. Not in front of her. He was her anchor, not her voice. This was her truth to tell. Eloise turned to face the crowd. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried in the still morning air. "My name is Eloise Mercer," she began. "It is true that I was employed by Mr. Garrett. It is not true that I was treated fairly." She told her story. She did not speak of violence, but of a more insidious kind of cruelty. She spoke of wages withheld for imaginary infractions, of being kept in perpetual debt. She spoke of the way Mr. Garrett would isolate the women, turning them against one another. She spoke of the unwanted gifts, small trinkets that came with an unspoken price, of the way he would corner them in hallways, his presence a constant, suffocating threat. "He did not want employees," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He wanted a collection. He gave some of us a brooch to mark us as his." She reached into her pocket and held up a small, gaudy pin in the shape of AG. This was a sign of his favor. It was a brand. She then produced a small, worn pay ledger. "This is the book he kept for my wages. It shows that I owe him $50. She then looked directly at Jake Monroe. Jake stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "That is the book he shows the world," he said, his voice loud and clear. "But this is the real one." He held up a second, identical ledger. "I order supplies for Mr. Garrett's boarding house from a wholesaler in Boston. Last year, there was a dispute over a bill. They sent me a copy of his private accounts to prove the discrepancy. He was cheating them. 2. He opened the book. This ledger shows that far from owing him money. Mr. Garrett owed Miss Mercer over $100 in back wages. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The tide was turning. Sheriff Long stepped forward. "I have also been in contact with the authorities in 2 other counties," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "I have here sworn statements from 2 other young women who also managed to escape Mr. Garrett's employment. Their stories are identical to Miss Mercer's." The last of Garrett's composure cracked. He saw the faces of the crowd turning against him, their suspicion hardening into cold anger. He was no longer a respectable businessman. He was a predator caught in the light. He bolted. He shoved his lawyer aside and lunged from the porch, trying to run for the horses. But as he hit the street, he collided with a man who was pushing his way through the crowd. It was Jed Barlow, his face a mask of fury. "Where's my money?" Garrett Barlow snarled, grabbing the front of Garrett's fine suit coat. "That stampede cost me. You promised me a herd." "Get your hands off me, you backwoods savage!" Garrett shrieked, his Eastern arrogance turning to panicked fear. The 2 men grappled in the red dust of the street, a clumsy, desperate fight between 2 greedy, cornered animals. It ended in less than a minute. Sheriff Long was on them, her pistol drawn and steady. The cold, bright shine of handcuffs flashed in the morning sun as she secured both Barlow's and Garrett's wrists. Click, click. At that moment, the bell in the small white church at the end of the street began to toll for noon. The sound, clear and resonant, rolled over the dusty street, over the silent crowd. It was a sound of order, of judgment, of a truth finally brought into the light. Thatcher tightened his grip on Eloise's hand. She leaned against him, a small, almost imperceptible tremor running through her. They had won, together. Justice had not come as a thunderclap, but as a quiet, courageous voice that a community had finally chosen to hear. The dust settled slowly in the main street of Millwater. The raw energy of the confrontation gave way to a quiet, collective exhale. Jed Barlow, his face a mask of sullen fury, was led to the small stone building that served as the town jail, his conviction for cattle rustling a foregone conclusion. Silas Garrett, stripped of his fine suit coat and his smug superiority, was loaded onto a wagon bound for the county seat, where a federal marshal and a far more serious set of charges awaited him. His blustering threats faded into the distance, leaving behind only a bad memory. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low, sober tones. They looked at Eloise and Thatcher with a new respect, a shared understanding of a trial faced and won. In the aftermath, Jake Monroe approached them, his face etched with a shame that was deep and genuine. He stopped a few feet away, twisting his hat in his hands. "Thatcher, Miss Mercer," he began, his booming voice reduced to a humble murmur. "There are not words to say how sorry I am, for all of it. My meddling brought this trouble to your door, and I will not ever forgive myself for that." Thatcher looked at his friend, at the man who had stood with him against a stampede, and the hard knot of his anger finally dissolved. "You made a mistake, Jake, but you helped make it right. That is what matters." "It is not enough," Jake said, shaking his head. He walked to the side of his store, where a large, wooden-framed window, its glass panes catching the afternoon sun, leaned against the wall. It was finely made, the glass clear and unflawed, a rare and expensive thing in this part of the country. "I have been saving this for a special project, but I reckon its time has come." He hefted the heavy frame. "I want you to have it. Thatcher, for the ranch house. A house with some light in it is a less lonely place." It was more than a gift. It was an apology, a symbol, a wish for the future. Thatcher looked at the clear glass, then at Eloise, who stood beside him, her presence a quiet, steady warmth. He gave a slow nod. "We will find a good place for it. Jake, thank you." The ride back to the ranch was even quieter than the ride into town had been. The tension of the morning had been replaced by a new, uncertain space between them. They had been allies in a battle, partners in a crisis. Now, in the quiet aftermath, they were just a man and a woman in a wagon, their shared future an unwritten page. The horse's hooves made a soft, rhythmic clopping on the dirt road, a peaceful sound that seemed to encourage introspection. They were halfway home, passing a grove of aspen trees whose leaves trembled and shimmered like 1,000 tiny silver coins in the breeze. When Thatcher finally pulled the team to a halt, he did not look at Eloise, but stared straight ahead at the mountains, which stood clear and sharp against the blue sky. "Eloise," he said, his voice low and serious. He had not used her first name so directly before. "That letter Jake wrote, it was a lie, but the life it described, a home, a partnership, that part does not have to be." He turned to face her then, and she saw in his eyes not passion or romance, but something far deeper, something more honest. She saw the vast, lonely landscape of his life, and a quiet, hesitant question standing at its center. "I am not a poet," he said, his words simple, unadorned. "I cannot promise you a garden of roses or a life without hardship. This land is hard, and so am I, in my ways. But I can promise you my loyalty. I can promise you my protection. I can promise you a roof that does not leak and a hearth that is warm. I can promise you honesty, always. And I can promise you peace." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "Will you marry me, Eloise? Not because of this trouble, not because of what people might say, but because you choose to." Eloise looked at his strong, calloused hands holding the reins, the hands that had pulled her from the edge of a ravine, the hands that had held hers through a long, fevered night. She looked at his face, at the lines of grief and hard work etched there, and at the profound, startling sincerity in his eyes. He was offering her the truth, and the truth was all she had ever wanted. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will." She saw the relief wash over his face, a subtle softening of his entire being. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "And I am not choosing this because I owe you a debt, Thatcher, or because I am afraid. I am choosing this because when I am in your house, standing in your kitchen, it feels more like a home than any place I have ever known." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of their decision, with the shimmering of the aspen leaves, with the quiet promise of a life to be built together. But even in that peaceful moment, the ghosts of the past remained. As they neared the ranch, Eloise's own quiet fear surfaced. "Thatcher," she began, her voice hesitant. "Margaret, your first wife. I have seen her things, the Bible, the garden. I do not want to be a shadow in her place. I could not bear to be a replacement." Thatcher stopped the wagon again, this time in front of the house. He turned on the seat, taking both of her hands in his. "Look at me, Eloise," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Margaret was my life for 10 years. I loved her, and I will not ever dishonor her memory by pretending she did not exist. The grief I have carried for her, it is a part of me, but it is not all of me." He paused, searching for the right words. "You are not replacing anyone. You are not a shadow. You are like that window from Jake. You are letting the light back in. You are making a new place, in a part of my heart that has been dark and empty for a very long time. It is your place, no one else's." His honesty was a balm. It did not erase her fear, but it gave her the courage to face it. It gave the ghost of Margaret a place of honor, a place in the past, allowing the future to finally begin. Their wedding, 3 days later, was as simple and honest as the proposal. They did not go to the church in town. Instead, Reverend Caldwell, a kind man with a weathered face, rode out to the ranch. They stood under the shade of a tall cottonwood tree by the creek, the same creek that had brought them to a crisis and had now receded to a gentle, burbling stream. Sheriff Ada Long stood as their witness, her usual stern expression softened by a genuine, warm smile. Eloise wore her mended traveling dress. Thatcher wore a clean shirt. There was no lace, no fine clothes, no crowd of well-wishers. There was only the vast, silent beauty of the valley, the quiet words of the Reverend, and the steadfast presence of the few people who had seen their truth. After the simple ceremony, they walked back to the house. Eloise had baked a small honey cake to celebrate. She had been distracted while it was in the oven, her mind on other things. And the edges were a little too dark, the scent of it just faintly scorched. She set it on the table with a small, apologetic sigh. Thatcher cut a piece and took a bite. A slow smile spread across his face. Eloise watched him, her heart in her throat. "It is good," he said, and he meant it. She laughed, a real, unburdened laugh that seemed to fill the quiet house with life. "Love," she said, looking at the slightly burnt cake, at the kind faces of the sheriff and the Reverend, and finally at her new husband, is sometimes eating burnt food and saying it is delicious. The words hung in the air, creating a new memory, a new piece of their story. It was a foundation built not on perfection, but on acceptance, on honesty, and on the quiet grace of finding a home in the most unexpected of places. The high, wild summer bloomed across the valley. The season arrived not with the violent struggle of the spring, but with a deep, settled warmth that baked the red earth and turned the high meadows a dozen shades of green. The creek that had nearly torn their world apart now ran clear and cool, a silver ribbon weaving through the pasture. Thatcher, with the help of a few hands from a neighboring ranch, had finished the new irrigation ditch. Its steady, life-giving trickle was a testament to a future planned and built, a quiet promise made to the land. Life on the Kane Ranch, as it was now known in the valley, settled into a rhythm that was as steady and dependable as the sun's rise and fall. The days were long and filled with work, but it was a different kind of work than the solitary labor Thatcher had known for years. It was shared. He would ride out at dawn to check the herd, which was now healthy and growing, and return to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, and to the sight of Eloise moving through the kitchen, a place that was now unequivocally hers. Jake Monroe's window had been installed in the east wall of the main room, where it could catch the first light of morning. It had transformed the space, chasing out the last of the stubborn shadows and filling the room with a clean, hopeful light. Eloise's kitchen garden, once a forgotten patch of weeds, was now a riot of green life. Fat tomatoes ripened on the vine. Beans climbed trellises Thatcher had built for her, and the scent of thyme and sage hung in the warm air. Their conversations were often quiet, punctuated by long, comfortable silences. They spoke of the cattle, of the price of feed in town, of the need for a new roof on the barn before winter. But in these simple, practical exchanges, a deeper language was spoken. A glance across the dinner table, a hand offered to help her down from the wagon, the way he would bring her a wildflower he had found while mending a fence line. These were the small, solid bricks with which they were building their life. One evening in late August, after the supper dishes had been cleared, a letter arrived, brought out from town by a passing neighbor. It was addressed to them both. Thatcher lit the oil lamp, the same lamp that had illuminated their first tense conversation over a forged letter, and opened the envelope. The handwriting inside was neat but unpracticed. He read it aloud, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. It was from the two young women Sheriff Long had located, the ones who had escaped Silas Garrett before Eloise had. They had been resettled in a town 2 counties over and had found work as seamstresses. "We are writing to thank you, Mrs. Kane," Thatcher read. "Sheriff Long told us that you were the one who spoke up, and that because you were brave. Mr. Garrett cannot ever hurt anyone again. We did not think anyone would ever believe us. We did not think our voices mattered. You showed us they do. We pray for your happiness." When he finished reading, a profound silence filled the room. Eloise looked at her hands, folded in her lap, and then at Thatcher. His eyes were shining with a fierce pride, a pride that was entirely for her. In that moment, she understood that her quiet act of courage in the dusty street of Millwater had not just freed herself, it had sent ripples of freedom out into the world. That letter became the seed of a new idea. The following Sunday, they did not ride to Reverend Caldwell's church. Instead, the Reverend came to them. They had set up several rough-hewn benches in the main room, the one now filled with morning light. A half-dozen women from the surrounding ranches and from the poorer side of town sat on those benches. They were wives of ranch hands, laundry women, girls who worked in the town's only eatery. It started as a simple Sunday school, with Eloise reading a chapter from the Bible and leading a hymn. But after the prayer, she brought out a stack of old primers and a slate board. "Many of us," she said, her voice gentle but clear, "never had the chance for much schooling. A woman who can read her own letters, who can understand a contract or a deed, is a woman who can better protect herself and her family." And so, the Cane Ranch became a school. Every Sunday afternoon, the main room filled with the quiet scratching of chalk on slate, with the hesitant, then growing, confidence of women learning to form their letters, to unlock the strange, powerful magic of the written word. Thatcher would sit on the porch during these lessons, mending a piece of tack or oiling a saddle, listening to the murmur of voices from inside. He was a quiet, constant guardian of this new, fragile community that was blooming inside his home. He had spent years building fences to keep the world out. His wife was now building bridges to bring it in. The seasons began their slow turn toward autumn. The nights grew cooler, and the first hints of gold appeared on the leaves of the aspen trees. The rhythm of their life was deep and true now, a song they both knew by heart. One morning, just as the first pale light was spilling over the mountains, Eloise rose and went out into the dew-kissed garden. She gathered a handful of late-blooming wildflowers, their colors a vibrant mix of purple and yellow and white. She came back inside and arranged them in a simple glass jar on the center of the wooden table. The small splash of color seemed to fill the room with a wild, gentle beauty. Thatcher was at the stove, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. The rich, dark aroma was the same as it had been on that first morning, but everything else was different. Then, it had been the bitter, solitary ritual of a man walled off by grief. Now, it was a shared warmth, a simple, daily communion. He brought the mugs to the table and set one down in front of her. He did not speak, but sat beside her. Together, they looked out the new window Jake had given them. The world outside was waking up. In the wide pasture, a young calf, the same one Eloise had refused to leave for dead in the floodwaters, was testing its legs. It was no longer a shivering, fragile thing, but strong and sleek, full of a boundless, joyful energy. It kicked up its heels and made a series of clumsy, exuberant leaps, a small, vital dance against the backdrop of the immense, silent mountains. Eloise watched the calf, a soft smile on her face. A sense of profound, quiet peace settled over her, a feeling of having arrived at the end of a long, impossible journey. The words of her story, the true story, rose in her mind, not as a lament, but as a hymn of gratitude. By day I served in his kitchen. By fate, I found a home in the rancher's bed and in his life. She felt Thatcher's arm come around her shoulders, drawing her close. She leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart. He smelled of coffee and wood smoke in the clean morning air. He smelled like home. They sat there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, watching the new day being born, their new life stretching out before them, as vast and as full of promise as the Utah sky. Thank you for listening to our story tonight, and we would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and please consider subscribing to our channel Wild West Night, liking this video, and pressing the hype button to help share this story with more people.